Да, ну слушай, ну в связи с тем, что вот такие исследования появляются относительно НАТО, как бы готовы ли украинцы согласиться с таким вариантом, а большинство украинцев
So,
отказываются,
given
готовы
that
ли вы
these
доверить этому исследованию Голованова?
researches are appearing, especially about the capabilities of NATO
Возникает еще
and
вопрос
their battle readiness,
публикации на этой неделе, на которые мы
and
обратили
if we
внимание.
trust any of the sociological
При
research here,
публикации
53% of Ukrainians
Денис
who
Херш
are still not
утверждал
against of joining
достойное
NATO.
ожидание, как бы ему за 80 глубоко,
There is one more
что
publication I want to
украинцы
bring up in
примирятся.
this regard. There is an American journalist, Seymour Hersh, who is a rather elderly guy. He is octogenarian.
Куча якобы инсайдеров
Right.
бункеровской
He
базы,
was
в том числе, да.
rather well known for his
Да,
investigations with
сейчас
a lot of
недавно
insiders and all.
были в Аче,
He is the winner of
смотрели, но
Pulitzer
это
Prize.
как бы обычная
That's
американская
been a while
информация.
ago. Now he's being
Человек из
accused of all
оружия
different
сказал, да,
leftist
что США
behaviors,
интервенция
but I
в
understand this is a
Венесуэлу
somewhat
это
typical
со
discussion in the United
Так вот
States.
этот как бы человек, он сказал, что
Recently, he also made statements that it is United States and Norway that are behind blowing up the Nord Stream. So he came out and said that Crimea, Donbass, a part of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, are probably going to be left with Russia, but Ukraine will be able to join NATO as a trade-off. And he's stating that Kiev, under this offer, can actually join the alliance, the NATO alliance, but also will have to provide guarantees that there will not be certain kinds of munitions placed on the territory. And then there is a passage that he's giving to the political system to comment on that. So, in your opinion, how much can we trust this information being offered by an elderly journalist? Well, it's difficult to say, Nikolay. He's got a reputation as a person who is really thorough in what he brings up. But I did show before that even serious people do break once in a while. And leftism is a very popular Achilles heel. Force them to change some of the facts. But I would say that imagine that this plan exists, that whatever is left of Ukraine goes to NATO without certain munitions and certain arms and weapons. In the meantime, it means that all our military immediately turns into NATO troops. And that, I think, would be a rather plausible solution for our country. This case would mean that we would get a gift from God and a golden ticket, because NATO generally would mean a big collective security. But for Ukraine, it would mean a huge increase of a safety threshold. And those four regions that were occupied by Russia, according to our current statistics, they're already 75% occupied by Russians, and we don't currently have any feasible perspective to kick them out of there, only unless Ukraine will continue to increase somehow our military-industrial complex capacity. But Russia is not sleeping. They're also doing the same thing. So it means that it'll be a lot of time until we catch up with them and overtake them in our rhythm. But so in this case, us joining NATO is a golden ticket. But I'm looking at that also from the Russian perspective. What would cause them, what would push them to agree to Ukraine being in NATO? They would want to have all four regions that they were annexed, that they occupied, in its entirety or partially, but they would want that, and they would put a term for Ukraine to not join NATO. Anatoly Nesmyan today published, there is only one option that can change that. If Ukraine will be given nuclear arms, and there is a precedent, Russia already gave nuclear arms to Belarus. They still supposedly maintain control over those arms, but at least that would create some parity between Ukraine and Russia, and at least would put the threshold so high up that they would have to sit down and discuss. But I'm not sure if the West will go for that solution. Modern West is the people who are hiding from a flu-like disease, slightly stronger than flu, I mean COVID, and now they're having issues declassifying Pfizer information, whose attorneys are trying to put a secrecy on the data for the next 70 years. So I have my concerns. People who manage to give up all of their freedoms in light of COVID, from the Magna Carta from England, through all the centuries and all the freedoms that they obtained, they just gave them up in the face of that disease. So I have my concerns about their capability to resist. Okay, so just a few weeks ago, recently, you mentioned that this option to join NATO in a limited capacity was still on the table. I think Rasmussen was bringing this up. Nikolay, I think that would be a best solution for us in the current situation. I don't see a single reason why Russia would agree to that, to Ukraine in NATO. They would agree to Ukraine being neutral, de-armed, disarmed, with 4 regions occupied. They can put that on the table. But now, what can we put on the table against that? We can only put on the table a protracted warfare and say, okay, if you don't want to accept our terms, then we will be fighting to the last Ukrainian, to the last soldier. We will all die, but your cost will be a destruction so severe that you historically will lose as well. Is that what you're looking for? Then we'll suicide together. The only argument that Ukraine has will try to fall in the abyss in a way that would drag you with us. So, right, we got ourselves to the end of the line. That's the only argument we have left. We can suicide ourselves together. But then it'll also be technically a pretty complex task, because when you run out of shells and run out of bullets, regardless how heroic we are, it'll be rather difficult. In the meantime, they will have rotten Korean and Chinese bullets and shells that are not flying well, but the problem is that they do have those crappy ones, and we do not have those civilizationally more advanced, higher level NATO type munitions. And that's it. Your other words, because you did mention before that Russia also doesn't have much capacity to make another jump in increasing its capability, regardless of giving them numerical estimates. They're also in some sort of dead-end situation, because they will have to rebuild their cadre military, they'll have to mobilize more people, and they'll have to press Ukraine to do what? They wanted to get some collective security, you mentioned. The old one is broken since 1989. I was following your words in other streams as well, since 1989, Alexei. So it has been obsolete for quite a few years, and what's happening now is the consequence of that structure being broken and crumbling. What can replace that? What can be put on the table that Russia presumably wants and that the West may agree as well? And we can even imagine that Ukraine is not at the table, but there'll be some role of smaller countries. Ukraine is not really a small country, but let's say mid-sized countries, right? There is some role for our countries at the table too, and the rights, and somehow it has to be reflected, right? All right, so now let's look at the other problems that we have. Not from the side of the West, but from the side of Russia. Russia has a problem with land army. They are pretty advanced with electronic measures, with UAVs, but the army is fighting in such a way that the carriers of main experience, the platoon commanders, company commanders, they die too soon without having a chance to train their subordinates. Cadre military is already dead and gone, and it wasn't even used right. And not cadre, the mobilized ones, they barely can do stuff. That's why even to take Avdiivka, they accumulate their troops for half a year, and then they spend another half a year trying to take it. That's not the way you want to fight the big war in Europe, and ultimately it will not be a good way for them to win. But I have suspicion that if they have attacked NATO instead of Ukraine, they actually could have reached La Manche, English Channel, in a couple of weeks, because just according to German estimates, their army could stand maybe for a week against such a warfare that we are fighting now. So, looking on from the Putin side, he should have attacked a NATO country instead. He had more chances to capture them than to capture us, and I suspect NATO would be in a very difficult situation and probably would be talking about, well, we maybe should review our borders. But they were unlucky, they attacked Ukraine. So Russians definitely are not the talented kids in the room. They do not get the best results. And I'm not even looking at the situation of building their military or how effective they are. If we take their average one regional center in 6 months, they can be fighting that situation, that war for way long, right, to get any sustainable results. But they're doing something to improve something, and we and our allies are not. And let me ask you a question. If one side is trying to improve itself while two others are not. What will be the end of that situation in maybe not 1 year, but 2 years, 3 years? So our effectivity is -1 and theirs is maybe plus 0.5. So eventually that situation will definitely be in a worse place than it is now for us. And they're still learning, given the time and the effort they exert on the field, even from the lowest level, lowest ranks military, they're learning how to survive and how to fight. Plus, they're also investing a lot of money into their military industrial complex. They actually created probably the biggest jump, the biggest rush in the military industrial complex since the Second World War. And they didn't invent anything. They just afford credits for the companies that are making munitions and making UAVs. They're buying those UAVs from them and then give them more credits. And if you do not take money out of the economy, if you just keep it in, you actually create a certain GDP product and you control inflation. And generally for the economy of the country, it's a pretty good system that works. Americans use that to become superpower, by the way, and Poles built their roads in the same way by not letting the money out of the country. The ones that they printed, they were investing inside, and they were not letting people to take the money outside much. And we made a mistake. We were buying a lot of Belarus materials and were exporting money out of the country, so we did not learn on that. So Russians are acting in a way that geopolitically you could definitely do better. They're not stellar, but they're a lot more stellar than we are and than the West. And that's generally enough to win in a long-term warfare. Now, speaking of collective system of security, even Ukraine joining NATO is generally a return or attempt to return to the 24th of February of 22. And this is an attempt to rebuild the system of balances in the previous framework of Yalta-Potsdam agreements, which doesn't work as a system. So if you want to be serious, you need to sit down at the table and have a serious conversation about the real interests of the sides, what are the reasons for the conflict, and to try to build a new system anew that would take into consideration these real interests and would preclude the appearing of the armed conflicts. And who is capable to sit down and do that today? These guys in the West, I doubt they can. They are living in a model that is called the dead are burying their dead. The death of Kissinger actually turned out to be a symbolic event. It shows that the last who could think as adult on the West is dead, and there is nobody left on the bench to substitute. And he, as a fellow from the old times, suggested to go back to the system of realpolitik, take a pen and start noting the interests of all sides, because people wanted to wipe their butts with Russian interests and they got war, and ended up not being able to conduct this war in the way they thought they would. And Russia, unfortunately, is clenching its teeth and is still fighting. Yeah, not effectively, yes, barely and very crudely, but they're still fighting it. So I think it would make sense to sit down as the world globally, sit down and start to draw out the borders of the new system. Because otherwise we're saying that yes, dictatorship, yes, freedom against dictatorship, but on the other hand, we're conducting trade for $500 billion, right? Or we get the missiles in our heads with American chips from Intel. Or Russia is still able to buy the digital machines that allow them to create those munitions and other military tools from the industrial nations. Because to reconcile that, you need a new system. NATO doesn't really work. It doesn't work the way it should. We want to join NATO, but I have serious doubts that it would work as advertised in case of a big conflict. If Russia would attack Lithuania or Estonia or Poland, I have serious doubts, looking at all that scary NATO, that would even work. So NATO and United Nations, these are all the artifacts of the past. We need to be building a new system. And for that, we need to sit down and seriously talk among all of us at the table. And I unfortunately do not see people who are capable to do that, neither in our country nor in the West. And that means the war will continue. And if the war continues in the current state, it will continue in a fashion that we definitely would not like. Alexei, you mentioned Kissinger. I wanted to save this question for deeper of the show, but I'll ask the question now. Look, Venezuela and Guinea are trying to, Guyana are trying to figure out the conflict that existed 200 years ago. And Kissinger did talk about Ukrainian-Russian war. He said that after the end of this war, there shouldn't be any gray zones left in the world. And these gray zones of smoldering conflicts, they exist throughout our planet. And there are a lot of unreconciled issues between countries. And they can be glowing like embers for centuries and then unwrap themselves hundreds of years later, like Venezuela's story. Do you think, and I'm trying to formulate it better, maybe it's a very rhetorical question, but there is some inheritance from Kissinger, some Kissinger school of diplomacy, if you want. Do you think the world can create still some stable construct where there would not be any smoldering conflicts, gray zones like this? Or would it be a different type of administration? And to come to some agreement between people with very different interests? I would say that those people who sat down at the table in 1945, they have diametrally opposite interests. Communism had a goal of destroying capitalism. Capitalism had a goal of destroying communism. Yet still, they figured a way out how to negotiate, and having other wars, Korea, Vietnam, Africa, and other places, they managed to avoid a big war in Europe. So now the juxtaposition is not that severe. Right, we have China with communism, but it's not exactly a communism there. So one can say, yes, it could be done to achieve some agreement. It could be worked out. But unfortunately, the best minds right now are trying on both sides, in Ukraine and in the West. They're still trying to get back to the 24th of February, which doesn't exist anymore. So I'm not believing in the politicians currently. I think as a result of this crisis, there'll be some leaders that will show up and who will have to sit down and discuss. Because otherwise, our other alternative is another big war, and I'm very not sure that the West can win that war. I will believe that it can when they will show me at least a production of 1 million artillery shells a year. Then we can talk about the perspectives of the West to win such war. I'm not even talking about 17 millions, right? Exactly, not even talking about that. So this week, also, Mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, an ex-boxer, gave an interview to Spiegel, who said that Ukraine got on the rails of authoritarianism and we are not too far from the time when we will not be too different from Russia. So we know that there is an issue with that in Ukraine. Klitschko just actualized the problem. And there definitely is an ask by German society that is trying to refuse from some of the obligations and step away from some of the funds it promised to create for Ukraine, right, to diminish 50 billion down to 20 billion because they gave some military resources. Right, let's just take away 20 billion of aid to Ukraine, because why do they need that? And in the meantime, I also see the conversations that are done by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Chancellor that Ukraine is the only barrier between them and Putin. Yet they're still eager to take away 20 billion. So one of the greats said that the thing that is worse than having a West as your enemy is having a West as your ally. That just definitely reminds me of that Cherry Martita documentary where our allies are trying to smash themselves into the wall. You know, Nikolay, what's the main tragedy of our people? That I think that maybe in the conflict of globalists and realists, we bet on the wrong side. We spilled the blood to jump in the camp of the losing side, and that may be our tragedy. I think you're repeating Pavel Shelin, with whom we argued in the stream. Oh, damn, did he say the same idea? Yep, he did. All right. I am looking at the situation and just thinking that when our allies will stop taking away money from the stabilization funds for Ukraine, and perhaps we'll start producing enough artillery shells, I'll be glad to review this point of view. But right now, I see President of Germany visiting Qatar and being forgotten to be met. He sat in the airplane on tarmac for 30 minutes while the official reception service in Qatar was figuring out how to do that. And meanwhile, Putin was met in Qatar with almost a horse parade, right? So what's the global signal in that sense? Why Putin is making a statement on G20 and in other places, and that's while being diplomatically isolated. And Times is actually considering maybe including him into the People of the Year list. What war? For what values are we talking about? Imagine Putin now on the cover of Time Journal, and what we as Ukrainians will be doing with it. We, the ones who are spilling a ton of blood daily to defend these presumed valuable values of the West. Does it concern you that we maybe are on the wrong side of history? Because we are bleeding, we are wasting our defenders. Klitschko is coming out and saying about totalitarianism encroachment, and our allies come and say, well, let's take 20 billions from that fund. Or Americans, they're so nice allies, but when you turn to them and say, guys, you realize that if you don't provide support, that means physical death of Ukraine. Well, they say it's such a difficult sum of contradictions. Everything is so complicated. It is so unclear. And, come later. We maybe a week later. We don't have money or weapons for you, but let's talk a bit later. You come to them again, tell, hey, we'll die, we'll physically die. And they say, no, the border with Mexico is more important. And that's the real situation in the politics here. It's not what they're telling you in the telemarathon in Ukraine. That's how it looks like, for real. And then you also get 4 different articles a day about how Ukraine is corrupt, bad, didn't organize counteroffensive properly. So it's really a good story, right? I really don't think, Alexei, we had a choice in this history what to bet on, because you've seen that since 2014, probably even better than I did. And you are probably more attentive in working with this problem. Nikolay, we should have been done wise and well-balanced politics since 2014 and even earlier. Well, problem, Alexei, is that even you are giving an interview to a German press right now and telling them why you are in forced political immigration. That doesn't really add understanding to our allies that Ukraine is a democracy that is fighting for democratic values. Well, Nikolay, I'm sorry, but I was not the one who forced myself into immigration, right? When we get congressmen beaten up by police and investigative organs, what democracy are we talking about? Right? And I'm here in the West. I'm blessed to be here, but now I've thought that I understand the West well, but now being here for several weeks and communicating with people who have power, who have connections, I start to understand what the real West is these days. It is the problem of our leadership and all of us. When the West has a perfect set of tools to put on the table why they're not helping. You tell them about shells, they tell you, well, you didn't let your president for a democratic visit. You tell them about shells, and they tell you you have corruption. You tell them money and shells are important to end the war, and they tell you, well, Alexei, you are a political immigrant right now. What are you talking about? So who created that situation? Who created that situation? That's my question. So what I'll tell you is when in 2010 we were sent to go hiking in Budapest, we were basically spat in the face by Merkel and who was in France, Hollande at that time. Everything was crystal clear, should have been crystal clear to us. Bulgaria, with all respect to Bulgaria, is in NATO. Ukraine was 100 times more ready for NATO, politically, democratically, industrially, with everything else, military potential. But we're not in NATO, and they are. And or even be in the European Union, right? We were spat on back then. That's when we should have stopped and turned. We had a choice. We just passed it. And Ukraine keeps repeating the same mistake over and over again. You know how it sounds? Like in that anecdote. Well, son, did those polls help you? Old Testament, there was a moment when the enemy is attacking Judea, and the Tsar is saying, "Well, don't worry, there'll be some aid from Egypt with more weapons and all." And the aid never comes, and they lose. So relying on that Egypt is the main mistake of Ukraine. You need to rely on yourselves. But again, speaking of ourselves, look at what we're doing to ourselves. So I don't know how to find a way out of this situation, Nikolay. I seriously am holding my head and trying to understand, okay, what can I do? Trying to push for some aid, to explain about some perspectives, knocking on the doors, meeting with people here. But like that little bird that Tom did that's trying to stop the sky from falling with its feet. It's a catastrophe. I'm not picking up words today, but yeah, it is a utter catastrophe. All right, let's formally finish this topic with Mayor Klitschko, and that's with all things happening in Ukraine, with some political repressions and all, right? In the meantime, all the parliamentary fractions, they come to agreement to sign a document that there will not be elections until the end of martial law, that nothing needs to be changed. Oh, yeah. These are a fantastic group of people. They cannot sign the law delineating responsibilities between superior commander and commander in chief, but they managed to adopt a law about no elections before the end of war. People who hate each other and attack each other 24/7, 365 days a year, they quickly found common language about this topic. You know why? Because they totally understand that they will not be re-elected first, and then they'll have to answer for all of these errors. So it appears that each fraction will get a lesser influence at the end of elections. Kolya, there'll be none of these people in there. People will not forgive them. There'll be no these fractions after re-elections. I am not even spilling all that I know. We're just relying on the things that already become known in media. If I start bringing up all the things that I know for a fact, personally, then it won't be just description of so-called mass suicide of the country. There'll actually be real suicides of some people, because things are much worse. And people who understand that, they understand that they're not going to be reelected, and they likely will be answering for all their mistakes, for all their ways. And they're lucky if they'll be answering through judicial system. Some of them probably will be just hunted down. And then we have fellows like Rahamia who flying to United States and running shoes and sneakers worth $1,000, right? To tell how poor we are and that we need money. Well, he's officially a multimillionaire, right? So he should have. No, I'm just saying, I'm not attacking his personal dress choice, but you shouldn't be doing that, because average sneaker is what, $100, $150. Okay, so apologies to our chat users who are asking me questions and ask me to react to things quickly. I'm sorry, I cannot. I'll just be asking questions. What I have on my list, and I'll try to pick some of yous. But Alexei, you mentioned that we had a chance to turn around since 2010 or 2014. But we had Yanukovych for 2 terms. What could we do? Well, his main mistake was that he was turning Ukraine towards Russia, when we should be turning towards our own interests. We have our own geopolitical and economic interests that you could calculate, and we should be concentrating on that. It means not only building relations with the global West. We should also be building relations with the global South, with Russia, with Belarus, with many others. And we had a chance to do that. But we said what? We said, screw Moscow, and decided to go run quickly, join the West. And now, here's the question. Should we have been running towards the West when it's spat in our face in 2014, in 2010? My personal opinion, Alexei, we did not really run towards anyone. I don't think we had a consolidated government policy, unlike the big established countries. We didn't have our interests established with majority of foreign players. Right? Oh, indeed. We do not have ambassadors in many countries. We still don't have an ambassador in Britain, for example. We're fantastically defending our interests. We're so amazing. How we are fighting for our survival. Well, sorry for interrupting you. We lived in a paradigm of doing no action, right? But perhaps we should not be affording ourselves to be so dormant with a territory that big. we should be playing bigger. You know, Yuriy Romanenko, a friend of ours who is not participating in our stream today for whatever reason, he said once that Ukraine will keep only the territories that match its level of internal organizations. So now I'm looking at how we do things. I actually am really concerned about us losing more than the current 20%. Indeed, Israel, that is often being brought as example, though, they have a much smaller territory. I just recently started comparing their territory to ours, and it's very small. And it's 9 million people, right, living there, but it's a very narrow strip. Well, yeah, this is the widest. At its widest, it's 90 kilometers. So it's smaller than from the border with Poland to Lvov, right? Even less than that. Right, that actually would be Israel and a little more. Another interesting topic related to Israel. For 22 years, US and the West are fighting together with terrorism. Since 2001, they've been chasing ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and everything. And now there is a terrorist act on October 7th in Israel, and what? They all are talking about the same goals that Hamas was pushing for. And now they're pushing Israel to acknowledge that, yes, operation in Gaza is good, but at the end you'll have to help create a Palestinian state. So after 20 years of fighting and pumping trillions, not even hundreds of billions, but really trillions of dollars, they are conceding to terrorist demands. So what were they fighting with? Imagine you have some investor or some person who is inventing a business comes to you as an investor and says, hey, Kola, give me 100,000. And in 20 years, we'll give you, I don't know, 10 liters of pure water, whatever, just imagine something. And you come to him in 10 years and he says, well, no, we were trying our best, but nothing really worked. So Israel is one of the strongest countries in the Middle East. Nanotechnology, special services, military, industries, a democratic society, they all understand that they'll be done with if they don't unite. And they're being broken now. And they're being forced to help with the Palestinian state. And now I have a question. So what were you fighting for? And I also told Israelis that those 2 aircraft carriers running to your borders, that's not only for controlling Iran, that's also for controlling you. So you wouldn't fight too strong for your own survival. That's the West. That's the modern West for you today. So those people in Israel, how did they react to your statement? Well, many of them do agree with that because they have a long history of looking at that. When they listen to my estimate of situation, they're smiling and saying, welcome to Israel. That's how we've been living for 70 years. And as David Gendelman said, the only lesson that you guys should have derived from Israel history is that you can rely only upon yourselves to survive. And we didn't want to take that lesson. We were saying that we are the eastern flank of NATO, and indeed we are the eastern flank of NATO. If not us, Russian army would have been actually targeting the NATO countries already, and they would be retreating beyond Wisla as they were writing in the Polish defense plans. And they're looking at us at their eastern flank and saying, well, yeah, we're giving you too much aid. Let's take 20 billion away from you. You're not bleeding enough, right? It's good that you're bleeding, but not enough. Well, I remind our viewers that we still have an active fundraiser for our servicemen for their detachment card. 14th detachment. We gathered... How much did they ask? They asked for $1 million, right? We started raising, and we'll put a link. I think we only 149,000 short of the requested amount, so we'll probably put another fundraiser at the video because this one likely will be closed. Yeah, that's important, by the way, that we do provide everything for our soldiers, regardless of all the political rumble and things we're doing here. They're the only ones standing between us and our physical death. Okay, let's finish that European topic. There was an article in Politico. Putin's pal Orban is pushing European Union to the brink because of Ukraine. And the December summit of European Union will become the decisive point. How far will Budapest go to preclude any European aid to Kiev? Well, they're formulating the title very interesting. But, by the way, the Netherlands that were supposed to provide us with some F-16s and the right wing winning there, where are those F-16s now? And Fico in Slovakia and in Bulgaria, there is a right wing winning who's saying that probably there'll be no aid to Ukraine. Is it just Orban? Or is it a bigger problem that Europe has definitely defined itself in a turn towards right? And European right is definitely anti-American and pro-Russian. There is not a single right-leaning party in Europe that would not be posting question that Europe needs to get out of the influence of the United States, and the main lever for that is to build good relations with Russia. And where is the place for Ukraine in this world? Well, and there was also an article in Spiegel about why Putin has all the reasons to be happy with himself. So he did not become a pariah. Right, Nikolay, after all we've talked today about, when they're saying that the West is dumb and silly and everything is pretty bad in the West, they're actually right. It doesn't diminish the fact that everything is awful in Russia, but Putin was, a few years ago, a couple decades ago, was a very pro-Western politician. And this whole war happened because we and Russians have lost our dignity. We lost our dignity for the right to change the master from Moscow to Washington, and they lost their dignity trying to prove that Moscow is not worse than Washington by blackmail and by physical force, trying to show that, hey, we can do just as Americans do. All science, political culture at large, everything was degraded because Russia tried to make all of that to match American standards, and they degraded what they had. And they paid a huge price for just trying to get the West to like them. And now we are killing each other, surprisingly, because we both are fighting for some attention from the West. And indeed, Russia looks like a druggie getting off the needle, but still, it makes sense to see Russia as a druggie who somehow trying to get cold turkey off the Western needle. And we're laughing at it, saying, showing how bad it is and all, and he's rolling on the floor, biting elbows. But they managed to withdraw from that Western needle, and we are sitting on that needle more and more, and we're being denied a larger dose. And that's the main difference. This whole war is a fight for dignity for both us and for them. If we remembered about our dignity, that would have been different. The tragedy of Ukraine is not that the master became too stern and too indifferent to our destiny, but in the fact that we decided to have a lord over us, a master over us, when the master is no more. He changed his paradigm, and I doubt there'll ever be a master again in the face of the Western civilization. And back then, when in the 2010 they spat in our face about adopting us in NATO, that's when we should be making those decisions. Even now, it's not too late to make them, but who are those people who failed to make them back then? I don't know, Alexei, but tell me in that framework that Putin did not become a pariah. They are mentioning that soon he'll be visiting Saudi Arabia and UAE and Saudi Arabia. Do you think it can become the center of leadership in regards to the security configuration? Because it does affect its own interests too, right? Saudi Arabia, China, all the major players, Russia, United States, Britain, France, Germany, Eastern Europe countries, African countries, South American countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, they all need to play that game. This is a serious game that needs attention. And we need to sit down and find common interests, because these proxy wars, nobody can really conduct them well. Russia is lacking technology, China doesn't have enough battle experience, NATO is lacking balls and artillery shells, and that's a very big and silly game on behalf of all humanity. This is a collective idiocy to play like that, and that should be ended. with. But who will be bringing that question on a global scale that this is dumb and we need to be doing it differently? Kissinger was the last who tried to make everybody think, but he is no longer with us. So we don't have Kissinger here to help us. Who is new Kissinger? Who will be the new person to come out and say we all are doing collective idiocy? How about we find a way to live in peace? We can compete, but at least without deaths and destruction. What's an idiocy to do that in the 21st century? That's how the question should be posed. Alexei. So, do you think Saudi Arabia can become an organizing force? They can be one of the key players. Their interests, of course, need to be considered. Another important question that is stemming from what you were saying about the United States, and I think it's a really good place to ask it. Over 90% of American aid to Ukraine is supposed to be sent to its own military-industrial complex to produce arms. They're saying themselves that in a balance of parity between ourselves and China, we are not really building enough. We're building the best arms, but not in the right quantities. There's a huge demand for it. We need it. But for some reason, we're not building it in good enough quantities. So this is strange from the standpoint of a usual economic logic. If there is a demand, then why don't you satisfy that, right? Why not to satisfy the growing demand? What's up in States? You're in there, you're talking to people. Nikolay, let me try to explain what Americans are. Remember Afghanistan? So the cleaning lady, the janitor in the base, was paid about 8,000 a month for her work. Why? For security and danger and all. So when they were spending about 250 millions a day, and that's roughly they were spending most of this money internally. Most of that money was staying inside the American economy. They learned the trick a while ago. So when they spent a lot on Ukraine, they actually invested money in their own economy. What they do, they give us older, outdated, or obsolete weapons, and they are ordering new ones and the military-industrial complex to replace them. And when you watch some reports, when they show who's working on these shell factories and who's making Stingers and missiles for HIMARS, you see that there are pretty old fellas there. There are retirees, 60 plus, and almost 70-year-old guys who are working those machines. When producing Stinger and HIMARS missiles, young ones are difficult to put them into these factories. What ammo? What war? What are you talking about? They're so far removed from it, and I have serious concerns about the ability of American establishment, deep state, however you call it, to enforce American hipsters to first fight for real and then to actually produce anything for military. And yet there are nations in the world who are still ready to produce ammo, who are ready to die for their leader and their ideas, and you're not. Oops. Yes, the West has better technology, but in the end of all, this war showed like none other that it's not technology that's solving tasks, but the infantryman who is jumping in the trench and facing the enemy bullets and ready to achieve goals. That's it. So the last question about General Muzhenko, who appeared in the interview to BBC, and he talked about no way we can negotiate about peace with Russia, but perhaps about an armistice. Do you think there is still possible some armistice with Russia? I think, Nikolay, these are false conversations. Armistice, peace, negotiations with Russia, this is a wrong formulation of the problem. The only true formulation of the problem is a system of collective security of the Eastern and Western Europe, including all members, all participants. Negotiations with Russia, negotiations about peace, that's all falsity. The only goal is collective security. And it's not too late, we have all chances, but somebody needs to pose this question this way. In this case, I understand we, and first of all you, went through all of the different options and came to the only realistic one. And you repeated it numerous times this stream, for which we are sincerely thankful. And for the whole picture of the week that you have drawn to us in this hour and a half. And regardless of that being rather emotional, it's super valuable. We appreciate your time, Alexei. This was Alpha and Omega channel with Alexey Arestovich. Do not forget to subscribe to us, support us on Patreon, and you can sponsor us on YouTube. And first of all, support the fundraiser for Ukrainian soldiers. The ones that are posting under the screen, we never touch these money. They go directly to the cards. We only verify that they're legit, that everything goes to the detachment that is requesting that help. And Alexei is posting on his Telegram the thank yous that we receive from these soldiers. Do not forget to subscribe to his YouTube, to his Telegram, and by the way, to Privateer Station that is bringing you all that in English. Thank you all, and see you later.